mini plan that will help you write a better essay. So people who write very, very clear introductions normally write very, very clear main body paragraphs and conclusions. If I see an introduction, I can pretty much predict what the rest of the essay is going to look like. A very good introduction is a good indicator of what the rest of the essay is going to be like. Don't worry. Examiners don't just look at the introduction. They'll always look at everything. But people who write bad introductions normally write bad main body paragraphs and conclusions. People who write very, very good introductions write very good main body paragraphs because it's kind of like a little mini plan. They know exactly what they're going to write about. Also, what is an introduction not? So it's not a chance to show the examiner how amazing your language is. Do not insert lots of fancy words and memorized phrases and all of these different things. If you can use high-level language, be my guest, use it. But if you don't know how to use it, don't stick it into your introduction because you're starting your essay off in a way that makes it impossible to read because the examiner has no idea what you're talking about because the collocations are wrong, the meaning of the word is wrong, the grammar is all wrong. Focus on clarity. It's also not a chance to hook the reader. You do not have to hook the reader. The reader is an IELTS examiner who's being paid to look at your writing. Believe me, they do not need to be hooked, so don't be writing any hooks. It's also not a chance for you to use memorized phrases or proverbs or quotes or anything like that. If you have a teacher who is telling you to memorize proverbs or quotes to put into your introduction or any part of your Task 2 essay, run very, very, very far away from them because they do not know what they're talking about. So there are 3 elements to a double question introduction. This is something that is specific to double question introductions. If you want help with other introductions, obviously you need to go a little bit farther, and this only applies to double question introductions. So number 1, paraphrase the question statement. And then number 2, briefly answer question 1. Number 3, briefly answer question 2. So they're not 3 separate paragraphs. There are 3 elements. So for a double question, if you do those 3 things and write them clearly so that it's easy to understand, so it helps the reader, you're off to a great start with your essay. So let's start off with how to paraphrase, and then we'll look in more detail at how to briefly answer both questions. So paraphrasing. So paraphrase is you state the same ideas, but using different words. So how would you say it in your own words? So when you paraphrase something, it must mean the same, but you're using different words to express the same meaning. And we can do that in many, many, many different ways. I'm going to show you 2 ways. I'm not going to show you 6 or 7 different ways because we've already been talking for about 35 minutes or something like that. And that would take way too long. So I'm going to show you the 2 most effective ways, or the 2 most common ways. The number 1 way is to use synonyms. So synonyms are words that mean the same, but different words. Or we can use this by changing the structure of a sentence. We can flip the clauses around, or both. I'm going to show you how you can combine both to paraphrase effectively. But let's look at some common errors. These are really, 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 really important. Most of you are not paraphrasing effectively because you're doing things that maybe you've been taught incorrectly, or maybe you just have a wrong idea about what paraphrasing is and what it isn't, and the different rules and requirements for IELTS. So the most common problem is people trying to change every single word. Sometimes there will be some words that either are impossible to change. For example, a date, you can't change a date, or, you know, a place name or a person's name. You simply can't change those words. Or sometimes you'll get a word that you don't know how to change. So if you see a word and you don't know how to change it, you can either just guess and try your best and 99% sure you're going to make a mistake, or you can repeat that word. There is a huge stigma, incorrect stigma, about repeating words. I don't know where this comes from, but many, many teachers teach their students that you can never repeat a word. Let's think about how ridiculous that statement is. Think about articles and prepositions. Think about, you know, the word and, or the, or of. Some teachers teach their students that you can't repeat those words. That's ridiculous. Look at any good writing, and there will be several words that are repeated, maybe even in the first sentence. Also, as we've just mentioned, there are some words, for example, dates, times, place names, company names, people's names, many, many nouns that you just cannot change. You should vary your language as much as you can to demonstrate to the examiner that you have a wide-ranging vocabulary. That's absolutely true. But many of you actually fail the test because you are so afraid of repeating a word. Many, many, many times students have argued with me about this and say, oh, you don't know what you're doing. You repeated a word. Yeah, that's totally normal to repeat a word. The rule is vary your language as much as you can, but not to the detriment of your overall score. Changing words incorrectly. So this comes from people fearing repeating words. So they try and change words as many times as possible. And most of the time when they're doing that, they're doing it incorrectly. So the meaning could be wrong, the collocations could be wrong, the spelling could be wrong, the grammar could be wrong. Don't change a word unless you know how to change it properly, because all of those mistakes add up. If you're making mistakes in most of your sentences, it's impossible to get a 7 or above. Impossible. If you look at the marking criteria. Also, not thinking about grammar. When you change words, it changes the grammar within the sentence, and you need to be aware of that. Again, if most of your sentences have grammar errors in them, it's impossible to get a 7 or above. To get a 7 or above, most of your sentences need to be error-free. No errors in them at all. Think about that for a second. Think about your writing. Do you think that you can produce an essay where the majority of your sentences have no errors in them at all? That's a standard you need to get to. For many of you, it's not that you have problems with vocabulary and grammar. It's because you have been taught silly rules like you cannot ever repeat a word, and that's causing you to get a low score because you're making so many mistakes as a result. So let's think about synonyms. Be very careful here. Your synonyms must match and make sense. Just because they are synonyms does not mean you can automatically use them. So one of the biggest problems when people paraphrase is when they're practicing, especially, they'll see a word, and what they'll do is they'll Google that word or look that word up in an online thesaurus. And when you do that, it will show you, 20 or 50 different synonyms. Now, some of those synonyms you can use. Most of them you will not be able to use. Just because a word is a synonym doesn't automatically mean that you can use it when you're paraphrasing. Let's look at an example. So imagine you've seen in a question, rich country. So if you Google rich and look up the synonyms of rich, you might see decadent as a synonym of rich. And it is. Rich and decadent are synonyms. Do they mean the same thing? No, not at all. Someone can be very rich, but they can't be, they're not decadent at the same time. Look up the meaning of those two words and you'll see it means different things. Country and kingdom. So a country, yes, country and kingdom are synonyms. Can you use them when you're paraphrasing? No. Some countries are kingdoms. Most of them aren't. All right. So this is to show you that you can't just look something up and automatically use it as a synonym. Also, when you're in the test and you're thinking of synonyms, don't just write down the very first thing you think of that loosely relates to that word. A more accurate way would be to use synonyms that actually mean the same thing. Rich and wealthy mean the same thing. Country and nation mean the same thing. They're synonyms. They're close synonyms. They're not loose synonyms like these ones. And you can use those. So be very, very careful. Other thing when you're paraphrasing is you can change the structure a little bit. So most of the time what you'll do is there will be 2 or 3 clauses in the background statement, and what you'll do is you'll just flip the clauses around. So the last clause becomes the first clause and the first clause becomes the last clause. But when you do this, be very careful that your new sentence makes sense grammatically. All right, let's look at an example. So many developed nations have opened their doors to refugees recently. So if we wanted to change the structure, what we do is we just take the second part of this and open their doors to refugees, put this at the beginning, and then many developed nations put this at the end. But when you do this, you have to be aware of grammar, because when you change words around, the grammar changes and you need to be very careful. So I had one student on my VIP course, and when they tried to do this, this is what they wrote. Recently, refugees go to developed nations who open their doors. And I said to them, okay, think about the meaning of this sentence, think about the grammar, and then try to fix your problems. And they changed it to recently refugees have been taken in by many developed nations. So when they became aware of the grammar and became aware of meaning, they changed it so that it means that it's grammatically correct. Okay, so an effective way to paraphrase is to use synonyms and combine that with changing the structure slightly. You don't always have to use this, but it is an effective method.